Hello. In this video, I'm going to show the end results of applying the steps, the Hero editor, and not all the intermediate code copying and experimentation that I did. So let's start at the top with package.json. So Angular is a Node.js application. So it has things in common with other Node.js applications, such as package.json. Package.json is a configuration file. It's a dependency file. So npm Node Package Manager uses it to track the dependencies that you've added to our application. These are the dependencies that generating an Angular application has automatically added for us. I haven't added any additional libraries yet, but if you do, using npm Package Manager, they'll be noted here. The other thing in common that this has with other Node applications is the Node Modules folder. This is where the dependencies land. Also, the Angular application init also initialized get for us, so we're ready to have source code right out of the box. It's nice that it adds this get ignore file, which is sometimes difficult to track down and get right. But these are the folders that are essentially kept out of source control, kept out of get. For example, node modules. This is the dependency list that you don't want to include in source control because package.json, when you do npm install, will rebuild this dependency library folder based on what it finds in here. The next file we want to look at is index.html. So index.html for a long time has been the default name for essentially the main page in an application. This is a single page application, meaning that once the page is loaded, it's not loaded again. This is the only HTML that the browser sees. Everything else is generated in place. So we have this body, very simple, app root. And this is the root component, the bootstrap component of an Angular application. Let's see how that's defined. So the next level down, app.module TS. This is our bootstrap component. And it's an ng module. Ng modules are collections of components, services, directives, and pipes that make up a module. There's at least one NP module in an Angular application. This only has one, but there has to be one. It defines the declarations. These are the subcomponents that are made up in this ng module. It imports any libraries that the components need, the child components need, are defined here. And then finally, the bootstrap component. This defines the component that gets loaded in index.html. There can be several ng modules that group together related components in your application, but only one bootstrap component should be declared. And this is app component. So we have app.module following down from index.html, and then we have app module. And this is a typical Angular component. We see the parts of it. Component.css, component.html, component.typescript. So think of an Angular component as being a unit of HTML, TypeScript, and CSS, a component that appears on the screen. So now you have, essentially, instead of one big page that has related CSS and JavaScript in really an unstructured pattern, traditional web development, that one web page that might be quite large and quite complicated is then broken up into individual components that mind their own business. The HTML, very similar to templates that you've used before. So it's a blend of TypeScript and HTML. Here, the HTML header 1 and this component that we've seen before, app heroes, this is a binding to a data module. Where is the data defined? In its near module. So in the TypeScript component, there it is. Okay, the export class app component title Angular hero components. You see it over here in the page here. Very simple class, one property. Even though this is a very simple TypeScript component, it shows all the important pieces of the component. So this decoration that appears above the exported class gives it these properties. It defines its selector. What is its selector used? AppComponent.html. That's the selector in action. Bring up this component, essentially inserted in here. What is the template? The template HTML that goes along with this TypeScript. And then local CSS, if any. Normally this file will be empty here right now. So that's the top level component, app component. It defined this data right here, and then further down in the heroes component we'll see these elements being defined. Now we'll take a look at the heroes component. And again, the constituents of a component. Its local CSS, its local template, its local TypeScript file that works to essentially the business logic, the logic of this component. So again, it gathers in its decoration item at component its selector, that is, how it will be referred to in a template file, app-heroes. Template URL, that's the path to this HTML component, its template. Style URLs, its path to the local CSS. This is a pattern you're going to see over and over again in Angular. So in this Angular component, heroes.component.ts, we import component and on init from the Angular core. We're going to use those later. We import hero from the hero template file. We'll look at that again later. And here we have our decoration. At component is made up of this selector, this template URL, and this style URL, the sibling components that are right here, the sibling files here. We export the class, heroes.component, which implements the interface on init. On init is an Angular life cycle method. So there's several of those. This is one of the important ones in ng on init when the component is first initialized and about to appear on screen. It's a good place to put initialization code. We have an empty constructor. We'll use constructors later, but this is an empty one. And then we have the declaration of the hero data item here. Notice there's no keyword at the class level that introduces this. No var, no let, no keyword that introduces it. It implements, however, this interface. Now this interface, if you look at here how this is a nice feature of Visual Studio Code, you can hit the control key and go to this declaration. So here, this interface looks a little different than probably what you're used to in, for example, Java. This hero is specifying data members, ID number and name string. And here, we're imposing a type of type checking that doesn't exist in JavaScript. This interface specifies that any object that declares itself as using this interface will have an ID, which can be typed as a number, and a name, which can be typed as a string. And here we have the use of it. Hero, hero, the interface, equals, curly braces here. So imagine this, JavaScript won't have the colon and the hero. You can declare then the object on the fly. So you have the idea this object, when I use it, will definitely have ID and name, but you can typo those and make mistakes. This interface assures that this object have at least these two data properties. You can add more, but this interface says this ID, we will check this, and this object will at least have these ID and name. Notice that the object is still created on the fly with simple curly braces followed by what are essentially key value pairs. That's not different from package.json, JavaScript object notation. That's how it uses it as well, right? It's not exactly a JavaScript object. It's a text file, but it's laid out in very similar ways. That is, here we have an object. Here we have key value pairs. Here's a key value pair here with the value being an embedded object. These actual JavaScript objects can work the same way. It's a JavaScript type object with additional type protection thanks to TypeScript. So then let's look at our HTML template, heroes.component.html. We have a header to style, hero.name piped to uppercase. So pipes are very important here. We'll see the result of this uppercase. Not necessarily that we like uppercase, but the pipe lesson is a valid one. It allows us to format our data in a very convenient way. So format numbers, dollar amounts, etc. You can make sure that your data is looking good with these pipe objects very simply. Then we have details in the header 2, that's here. Then a span with the ID. And this is one-way data binding here. And we're adding it to a template. If you've worked in NBC architectures at all, you're used to template ideas. This is how we call out a job. Essentially, we're going to enter into TypeScript notation, and this is how we do it. Okay, two curly braces with our ID in the middle of it, and we have this as well. Here we have a div for our input area. We have label and input. This is standard HTML. This for equal name ties this semantically with the actual input ID. So the label is then tied semantically with the input ID and can be used for various things, tab to it and all that. Here we have two-way data binding, bracket followed by parentheses, then ng model equal quotes here, and this is actual hero.name tying it to the data declaration back in our TS component, and a placeholder, our default name here is that. Going back to app component.html, you can see how this works now. The initial app component, which is called out by its selector, h1 title here, the title coming from app component.ts, calling out the selector for app heroes, which was down below here in app heroes and declared, and then we have the unfurling of that component as well. So you can get out, I hope, a feeling of how Angular web pages are built then. They're single component, they're single page web files. This is the only HTML file the browser will get. Everything else is built in place. So a component calls up a component, up a component in this inverted tree structure. They behave dynamically and get loaded on the page then. And as the user interacts with the application, it brings up and closes out various components as it runs. The server then is never asked for an HTML file again. We'll return then to app.module and tie this together. So ng module, there can be several ng modules, but there has to be at least one with the bootstrap component that says to index.html what is the first component that gets loaded. After that, everything is loaded, nested inside of other components. We import libraries that we need. For example, when we did that ng module and with the two-way data binding, we needed to import the forms module, and we import it here, not directly where it's used, but in the ng model is imported as part of the forms application here. That's one of the things that ng module does. It imports the libraries that subcomponents within ng model need. It also declares these are the subcomponents that this module is made up of. The app component at the root level plus heroes component that was one level down here. All right. See you more in the next step.